Thank you all so much for coming to this very early session number 3, actually. It's astonishing. I didn't even know there were sessions so early. But authors in the brave new worlds of scholarly publishing. My name is Karin Wulf, and I will introduce our panel in just a minute. I want to particularly thank David and Rick. We did a session together at Columbia University in the spring on much the same themes, and I asked the two of them if they'd be willing to come to the AHA, although I mistakenly said it was going to be in New Orleans. And they said, in January? Of course we'll go. And then I thought, oh, it's that other professional organization that's going to be in New Orleans this year. Actually, it's in Denver. Anyway, I'm really very grateful. But I'm also grateful to the American Historical Association, the Omohundro Institute, and to the Society for Scholarly Publishing for being interested in this issue of humanists and thinking about scholarly publishing trends and how we are being pushed and are pushing different kinds of trends. As in so many other areas of our life, I think we're all discovering how important it is to be aware of the institutions, the economics, and the values that structure our lives. And it's in this spirit that we created this session. Rick Anderson is Associate Dean for Collections and Scholarly Communications at the J. Willard Marriott Library at the University of Utah. He's also President of the Society of Scholarly Publishing. He writes for the Scholarly Kitchen, where many of you may have read his blog posts. And his pieces are always interesting and exciting. It was 2 years ago at the AHA that I met Rick. He was lurking in the back of a session on scholarly journals, and a couple of us acted a little like we'd spotted a rock star, like, oh my God, I think that's Rick Anderson back there. If you haven't read Rick's pieces on Scholarly Kitchen, I encourage you to do so. His last post was on Greta Van Susteren and the controversy over her remark about colleges and universities wasting money on libraries, Greta-gate. And it's really a thoughtful piece, as well as just taking her down as she needed to be taken. David Crotty is editorial director for journals policy for Oxford University Press, and he's also the editor-in-chief of the Scholarly Kitchen blog, for which he oversees daily production of a blog that had 1.25 million page views last year, and for which he's written almost 300 blog posts himself. David also, in his spare time, has a PhD in genetics from Columbia into developmental neuroscience at Caltech, which he may or may not use in his publishing career. It's a source of controversy, actually. I'm a professor of history at William & Mary, a historian of the early modern British Atlantic, focusing on gender and family, which doesn't equip me at all to talk about scholarly publishing, but I'm also the director of the Omohundro Institute, which publishes both a journal, the William & Mary Quarterly, and books in association with our press partner, the University of North Carolina Press. We're going to try to keep our remarks relatively contained here so we can have some conversation among ourselves and also with all of you. David's going to speak about business models, Rick about licenses, and then I'll talk briefly about metrics. And I'm looking forward to the presentations and the conversation. So, David.
All right. Thanks, Karin. So I've been asked to explain pretty much everything you need to know about journal publishing and open access in about 20 minutes, so I'm going to talk fast. So I think this is a really interesting time to ponder our information infrastructure. For the last 20 years or so, we've been fed this pretty consistent narrative. Disruption is destroying all of our old institutions, and this is a really good thing. The internet will democratize knowledge. It will somehow magically make everything free, and the wisdom of the crowds will sort out what's important from what's trivial and what's false. And while it's fairly obvious that the internet remains the center for our communication and information needs, it's also slowly becoming clear that the honeymoon is over. As a society, we are now starting to come to grips with what the digital realm means and the business models that it supports, what those do to us as a society. We are beset with an approach that favors quantity over quality and that rewards offering a quick hit of emotional dopamine over careful research and editorial scrutiny. So these sins are now translating into real-world threats, and we are once again realizing the value of having information vetted by neutral expert third parties, be they journalists or journal editors. And doing either activity well with rigor and discipline costs time, and even in an online-only environment costs money. I think it's worth considering whether we as a society are too far down the information wants to be free path to shift to a business model where we value curation enough to continue to pay for it. And so with that in mind, I'm going to talk about journal publishing, how the business models work. The main one is a kind of an evolutionary model over the last 350 years that has evolved to where it is. And I'm going to talk a little bit about open access, which has been around for about 15 to 20 years and is still in a state of evolution. So if there's one take-home message I want you to get out of this talk, it's that things are complicated. We often hear very simple narration about scholarly publishing because it makes for a more compelling, easier to tell story with clear villains and heroes and simple answers. The reality is a lot more messy. There's an enormous amount of variety across the system in how things are done. Business models, quality, services offered, prices, profits, you name it. There are thousands of players, each with a different way of doing things. And this variety is a good thing, you know, so as an author, I think it's really important that you learn more about who you're publishing with and support those publishers with practices that best meet your needs. One common misconception we hear a lot is, so journal publishers, you're basically selling a product that you get for free. Journals don't pay for papers and peer review, and then we sell it back to the same researchers who did all the work. And the problem with that is an assumption that journal publishing is a product-based business rather than a service-based service industry. So researchers need a set of services performed for career advancement, for funding. Publishers provide those services at no charge to authors and in exchange receive the right to try to earn back their costs and then some through selling the resulting content to subscribers. Publishers pay for the costs of preparing content in the way that academia requires and take the financial risk on behalf of the authors. Researchers get the free services, and then rather than paying for them, they elect to spread the costs incurred among the readers of their papers. One of the more appealing things about the open access model, which I'll get to in a bit, is that instead it makes this a very simple one-to-one transaction where the author pays directly for the services rendered. So what are those services? And this is adapted from the writing of Michael Clark with a link to the article that it comes from on the slide. He says there are basically 5 main functions of journals. So number 1 is dissemination. Researchers used to communicate their results by sending letters around to one another, but by 1665, there were too many natural philosophers for this to be practical. So they said, all right, we're going to send everything to one person, Henry Oldenburg in this case, and he'll collect them all and he'll send them out to everybody. And you know, the journal was born, Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society. Dissemination is still important, but given the existence of the internet, journals are no longer really the sole way that we disseminate research results and perhaps are no longer the ideal way. Registration is next, laying public claim to discovery. I thought of this first. Again, another early function of journals. Again, while it remains something that journals provide, there are a lot of other potential ways this is being done now, so it's becoming a less important function. Validation. Are the results of this paper valid, established through peer review? It's a relative latecomer to journal functionality, really a product of the second half of the 20th century. Many attempts have been made since then to decouple validation from publication, preprint servers like the Archive for Physics, but so far without a significant amount of editorial oversight driving the process, that sort of review and validation doesn't get done. In a lot of cases, particularly in the humanities, this function is extended through a great deal of post-acceptance editing, really honing the argument to make it more effective. Next function is filtration. Time is a researcher's most precious commodity. Used to be fairly easy for everyone to keep up with their fields, but in this modern publish or perish academia, it's really impossible to read everything. And journals provide, I think, an important filtering mechanism for this sea of information. So ask any researcher, you know the best, the journals in your field, which are most relevant to your work, which publish the best papers, and it's really valuable in figuring out which papers to read first, if at all. And we're seeing a lot of new filtration mechanisms being applied, but so far these are all additive rather than substitutive for the important mechanism of journal brand and reputation. And then finally, designation. So a lot of academic institutions and funders rely very heavily on a researcher's publication record in making career advancement and funding decisions. So while far too much of this is reliant on one flawed metric, which is badly misused, the impact factor, journal brand still serves as a signifier in evaluation efforts, and this is a function of journals for which there is yet no substitute. So another common misconception is that all scholarly publishers are greedy, soulless corporations. To be fair, we are in a period of great market consolidation, and the biggest of the big publishers continue to grow bigger, particularly through mergers and acquisitions, while the small independent publishers are finding it harder and harder to compete or stand on their own. But there are over 2,000 academic journal publishers. 5 commercial publishers, however, account for more than 50% of the articles published. Elsevier, Wiley, Taylor & Francis, Springer Nature, and Sage in the social sciences. And names like Wiley, Blackwell, and Springer Nature will tell you a lot about the frequency of the mergers that are going on. The big size of these companies offers enormous economies of scale and efficiencies, which really greatly contribute to their high levels of profitability. When you hear about scholarly publishers, almost always you're hearing about these guys, and that puts everyone else in a difficult position because many different publishers are run in a different manner. So while those companies dominate the industry, the majority of publishers are much smaller. There's a significant amount of not-for-profit publishers, many associated with or owned by universities or by research societies. And these publishers generally charge lower prices than our commercial counterparts, and while most do their best to generate a surplus, the profit margins are usually a small percentage of those generated by commercial publishers, and then that surplus is returned to the research community, either at the university where the press is based, to fund things like scholarship and research, or the money goes back into the research society and is used on behalf of society members for things like funding meetings, scholarship, education, and the other services that societies provide. Here I separate out Oxford and Cambridge University presses from the others, as these two programs are each themselves larger than all of the other university presses combined. And it's worth noting that most university presses actually lose money and rely on financial support from their parent universities for their existence. I put arrows on here just because things aren't so neatly divided. Some research societies remain independent, publish their own journal themselves, but in the age of consolidation, we're seeing more and more of them signing on with publishing partners with larger houses, both for-profit and not-for-profit. The big publishers can offer them enormous savings simply because they buy everything, materials, services, personnel, paper in bulk. A small society might be able to hire one marketing manager, but if they sign on with a big publisher, they gain access to a global marketing team of hundreds. So much of the revenue that's coming into the big publishers supports and goes to the research societies that own the journals. So as an example, at OUP, around 70% of the journals that we publish 400 journals, around 70% of them are owned by research societies or institutions, and they keep the majority of the funds that are generated by the journals. The other big reason we're seeing so much consolidation in the market is the way that journals are sold. We used to sell individual subscriptions of journals, print journals to individuals. Then you got an online subscription, and you know, you'd either get the print copy or you'd have a password and you'd go log into your online subscription. That has shifted over to site licenses to institutions. So rather than having everyone on campus buy a subscription to the journal, the library would buy it, and then everyone on campus has access. And now we're really moving to a different model based on consortia and collections. Consortia are groups of institutions working together to increase their negotiating power. So rather than each individual University of California branch subscribing separately, they'll all get together and do one sort of consortial subscription and drive a better bargain. Collections or bundles of journals is also now the dominant way that journals are sold. Rather than buy each individual title offered by a publisher, instead the publisher usually offers what's called a big deal package of all of its journals at a greatly discounted price. And the upside for libraries for this is they get access to more journals at a lower cost per download, per downloaded article. The downside is that these big deals eat up a lot of a library's serials budget, and they really don't leave them any flexibility in what they're purchasing. So libraries, I think, have been really put into a hard place. The numbers of people doing research has continued to increase. Pressures to publish or perish have also gotten much more intense, so there's been an enormous growth in the research literature. And at the same time, universities have continued to decrease the percentage of their budgets that they spend on their libraries, despite, enormous increases in tuition revenue. So you have these two opposing forces driving up the amount of papers being published while at the same time cutting the amount that is available to spend on those papers, and that leaves libraries stuck in a lot of ways trying to meet the needs of campus researchers. And these big collection packages help in that they provide enormous discounts, but they make it really difficult for any journal that's not part of a big package to try and get into that very strained library budget. So getting into these sorts of collections is pushing a lot of independent publishers to join up with the big publishing houses. So those are the basics of the subscription business model, which continues to dominate. I want to turn for a few minutes to open access, as it's one of the bigger developments of the last 2 decades in scholarly publishing, although it's still only something like 3 to 5% of the total market. Much of the open access movement centers around biomedical research, which is very well funded and has publication needs that are very different from the humanities and social sciences. Humanities researchers are suddenly finding themselves thrust into the world of open access, where the mechanisms were designed for an entirely different community. So what is open access? Basically, anybody who writes a research paper wants it to be read. The fewer restrictions we can place on access to those papers means more people can get hold of that knowledge, and presumably the societal benefits from doing research will increase. And that's at the heart of the open access movement. It's very much in line with the shared mission of researchers, scholarly societies, and publishers. I spoke earlier about the services that journals provide to authors, and I said doing these things well costs money. So this sort of gets to the central issue for open access, balancing mission with practicality. How do we maximize the dissemination of knowledge while at the same time maintaining a high level of quality and a sustainable financial future? If you give everything away for free, how do you pay the bills? So if you ask 100 people what open access is, you'll likely get 100 different answers. There is a semi-official definition put together by a group of people who met in Budapest in 2001. It's kind of long and complicated, but I think it can be boiled down to the following basic statement. The goal of open access is that all scholarly content should be available electronically with no restrictions whatsoever on access and no restrictions on reuse of those articles other than requiring acknowledgement of the original author. So I want to break out those two concepts quickly, access and reuse, and consider them separately. First, access. There are 3 basic routes to open access in use today. Gold open access is usually meant to describe the author paying an article processing charge, and then the article is made freely available immediately in a journal. It's worth noting that this changes the business model for a journal from being reader-centric to being author-centric. And it has the unintended consequence of shifting the focus from quality to quantity, because the more you publish, the more money you make. Gold also has some drawbacks in terms of favoring better funded researchers or better funded fields over those with less funding. And it also concentrates a lot of the costs on a small number of productive research institutions rather than spreading them broadly across the institutions that consume the literature. To keep costs down, gold open access journals very often do away with a lot of author services, things like copy editing. Green open access is kind of a blanket term used to describe other methods where an article is made freely available, either outside of a formal journal, usually at no cost to the author, like putting it in your university repository, or as is becoming more common, making it freely available in the journal itself after an embargo period. Green open access relies on the continuing existence of subscription journals. You got to ask those journals to give everything away for free at some point. So to balance that risk of lost subscriptions, most green open access policies have an embargo period, which is a set of time that allows the journal exclusive rights to the article. And those embargo periods have to be set carefully to allow access as soon as possible, but not so soon that people stop subscribing to the journal. Green open access also often requires making an early pre-publication version of the article freely available, which may differ significantly from the published version, and that can lead to citation confusion. If there's a different quote in different versions of the article, which one is on the right page and how do you put that in a footnote? And then there's a significant number of open access journals that make articles available freely immediately, but they don't charge authors. It's often called platinum or diamond open access. And those journals are usually paid for by grants or by hosting institutions or libraries. Those journals are usually very low volume. They have problems with scale, so it's easy to publish maybe a dozen articles a year with an all-voluntary workforce, but if you start getting hundreds of submissions every single month, then it becomes somebody's full-time job, and then they need to get paid for that. There are also issues with these journals if the funding dries up. Very, very often it's easy to get a grant to start something up, but it's really hard to get a grant to maintain something that already exists. Couple terms, journals that publish strictly under gold or platinum methods are called fully open access, and those that employ this as an option for authors while still using the traditional subscription model are called hybrid journals. In practice, what exactly does open access do? What benefits does it provide? And there have been a lot of studies on this, and most of them have a lot of serious problems and are kind of inconclusive. So pretty much every study is an observational study. You look at open access articles in a journal and you compare them to subscription articles in that same journal, and you say, well, how did they perform? And because of that, that experimental design lacks a control for selection bias. So often open access articles are coming from very well-funded labs. They can afford the money to pay an open access fee. There may be a reason why they're better funded than the labs that can't. Also, you talk to researchers. They very often say, well, I don't have a lot of money to pay publication costs, so I save my open access fees for my really, really important articles, but my okay articles, I don't bother spending on that. So the studies are really looking at more than just differences in access. They're looking at two qualitatively different sets of papers. So the gold standard in experimental design then is to do a randomized blinded trial, and so far there's only been one of those done. Working with publishers, Phil Davis made a random set of articles in 36 journals in the sciences, the humanities, social sciences. Random articles were made open access and other ones were left as subscription articles, and then he compared those, how they performed. And the results were that the open access articles received significantly more downloads than the subscription articles and reached a broader audience. Basically twice as many full-text HTML views, 62% increase in PDF downloads, and more than 30% more unique visitors. Citations, which is that empty column there, remained flat. Despite more readership, there was no increase in the citation of open access articles. And what that tells us is that open access is an incredibly valuable tool for broadening access to the research literature. It really does what it's supposed to do. But what it also tells us is that researchers are pretty heavily concentrated at institutions with excellent access to the literature already. They're the ones who are going to do further research and provide citations, and open access doesn't really make a huge difference there. But what it can do is reach outside of the research community to policymakers, to educators, to clinicians, to patients, to researchers in private industry, people who consume the literature but don't necessarily create new research studies. Moving on to that second pillar of reuse, or of open access, reuse. So for the reuse issues, it's important to remember we're talking about copyright, the reuse of the actual articles themselves, these particular words in this particular order in these images, not the ideas presented in a paper. If I read a paper that describes a new medical technique, copyright prevents me from reselling a copy of that paper to you. It doesn't stop me from using the technique. So to be clear, we're talking about the reuse of ideas, not the reuse of ideas, but the reuse of the papers themselves. And to facilitate that reuse, open access articles are usually released under Creative Commons licenses, all of which have really confusing names, most of which are abbreviations, except for one of them. So the main license in use are CC by meaning attribution. This paper is by this person. Basically means any reuse goes. Any commercial, non-commercial reuse is permitted as long as you tell people who the original author was. And that's the required license if you adhere to the strict definition of open access. A lot of authors and publishers prefer instead CC by NC, where that reuse is limited to non-commercial purposes, or NC/ND, non-commercial, and you can't change things around and create what's called a derivative work. And really, I think a major issue arises here because the open access movement has been driven by the science community, and it's really planned around their needs. So for a scientist, the intellectual property generated by a research project is protected by patent. So if I'm a medical researcher and I find a cure for diabetes, the cure is the intellectual property, not the paper about the cure. But for the humanities researcher, the argument, usually in the form of the article or the book, is very often the end product of the research, and it's the only intellectual property generated. So I think it's an unfair set of rules that lets one group of researchers profit from their work and takes that opportunity away from another set of researchers. With the CC BY license, science researchers could still patent medicines or start spin-off companies, while humanities researchers could lose their ability to publish books based on their research papers. In general, open access remains a low priority for most researchers. Survey after survey of authors, they ask, well, how do you choose a journal? It's almost always the top reasons are journal reputation and relevance, quality of peer review, impact factor, and open access is generally put pretty close to the bottom. So it's not necessarily the researchers that are driving open access. A lot of this is now being driven by funding agencies, universities, and governments. And really, funders want to get the most bang for their buck. They see open access as a great tool for better dissemination of the discoveries they're funding. A lot of funders have instituted policies regarding access to papers describing research they've funded, and they're getting strict about enforcing them. Governments also, they want to display the return on the investment they're making in their universities. And the universities themselves want to show off their educational mission as broadly as possible. And this map shows kind of a sampling of policies. There's a group called RoarMap that currently tracks around 750 funder and institutional access policies, and this map is color-coded. You can see green for green open access and orange for gold open access, and it should be fairly obvious. There's pretty much a coalescing around green routes as the preferred mechanism. But I think the ubiquity is what's really important here. The number of policies is really impressive. Open access is a subject that the humanities and social sciences community has to engage with, and you guys have to get your voices heard. Improving knowledge is without a doubt a really good thing, but we have to do it in ways that are responsible and sustainable for each community. And we can't assume that what works for highly funded physicists will also work for historians. So with that call to action, I'll stop and move on to the next speaker.
How you doing? Okay, so I'm going to focus on one particular area that David touched on in the course of his overview, and I'm going to take a little bit of a deeper dive into it, and that's the issue of copyright and licensing in light of the needs of humanists generally. I am sure that everybody here has a really firm grasp on the basics of what copyright is, but I'm just going to go ahead and review them anyway. When you create an original work, and it could be an essay, it could be a piece of choreography, it could be a musical composition, any original expression that is in a fixed format, you in that moment become the copyright holder in the expression that you have recorded. That distinction, the distinction of fixed format, is really important, because if you're at a conference reception and you're talking with one of your colleagues about your theory that, say, the works of Shakespeare were actually written by Harpo Marx, you're having this conversation, you're explaining your theory, you do not have any copyright in that theory. What happens is, if you write it down on a cocktail napkin, or if you write it into an email, or even if you tweet it, your expression of that theory is then a copyrighted work, and you are the copyrighted holder. A fixed format doesn't have to be ink on paper. It can be, again, it can be an email message. It can be a voice memo on your iPhone. Any recording of your idea is under copyright, and you become the copyright holder in the moment that you create that document, whatever it might be. Now, what the law gives you as the copyright holder is a set of exclusive but limited rights. They include the right to copy, the right to redistribute, the right to publicly perform, the right to create derivative works, and a couple of others. They're exclusive in that you are the only one who has those rights. They are limited in that there are nevertheless things that members of the general public can do with your original work that fall under the category of fair use, which we'll talk about more in just a minute, that even though they look like infringements on your exclusive rights as the copyright holder, they are nevertheless fully allowed and legal. And nobody has to ask you if they can do those things with your work. It is in the nature of fair use that you don't ask the copyright holder whether you can do it or whether the copyright holder agrees that it's fair use. It doesn't matter whether the copyright holder agrees. Fair use is determined by the law, not by copyright holders. This is the point that I think is so important to understand about the exclusive rights of copyright holders, and this is a point that is sometimes, in my view, deliberately obscured by people who would like to change the way we think about copyright. Being a copyright holder means having the right to say yes, and importantly, it means having the right to say no. If I write an article or a posting in the Scholarly Kitchen or anything else, I have the right to say, you, David Crotty, as the EIC of the Scholarly Kitchen, you may publish this post, and you, the EIC of some other blog, you may not publish my post. Having both of those rights is very important to me as a copyright holder. It may be more or less important to any of you in any particular circumstance, but overall, that is a very important thing that copyright gives me. It gives me the right not to associate my work with an organization or person or publication with which I don't want it to be associated. So when you become the copyright holder in the moment that you create your original work, then when it comes time to publish it somewhere, one of two things is going to happen. The publisher is either going to require you to assign copyright to them, which is perfectly legal, and well, there are people who would argue that that's not a legitimate requirement. It's a very common requirement for publishers to say, yes, we will provide you our publishing service. In return, you transfer copyright to us. Everybody in this room has probably at some point transferred copyright to a publisher. Other publishers, or in the same publishers under other circumstances, instead of requiring you to assign your copyright to them, will say, you only need to give us a license to publish your copyrighted work. You remain the copyright holder, but sign here, and that says that we are permitted to be the first publisher or the first North American publisher or whatever of the work in question. That distinction, the distinction between a copyright transfer and a license to publish, is really important. So let's talk a little more about licenses. A license is a mechanism by which you as the copyright holder assign some or all of your rights as the copyright holder to somebody else. Fair use is not licensed use. Fair use, again, is use that is made without your permission, but within the bounds of the law. So the classic example of fair use, and anybody who is as old as me or older will remember when many of us used to buy vinyl LPs before vinyl was actually a hip thing. And then if we wanted to listen to that record in our car, we would make a copy onto a cassette tape and put that in the car and play it there. Well, on its face, that seems like a breach of copyright. We are copying without permission of the copyright holder. But that's a classic example of the kind of use that is allowed by the law under fair use. In fact, that very example, the example of making cassette copies of LPs, is actually enshrined into Section 107 of the US Code as an example of fair use. You didn't have to call up the record label and say, is it okay if I make a cassette copy? You just did it. It was fair use. So fair use is defined by the law, whereas licensed use, the parameters of a licensed use are defined by negotiation between the licensor, the copyright holder, and the licensee. In libraries, when we subscribe to online journals, we are no longer buying stuff the way we used to. We used to pay a subscription fee, and we would get objects in the mail, which we would then take care of. That's really no longer what we do. What we now do is we license a right of access to content that is controlled and maintained by somebody else. So every time we subscribe to a new journal or a new database, we negotiate a contract with the publisher or the copyright holder, and that contract is a license. A very particular type of license that David talked about in his bit is the Creative Commons license. Creative Commons licenses are different from other licenses in that they are not negotiated between two individuals. The Creative Commons license is a very handy tool by which you as the copyright holder can signal that you are licensing your content under whatever terms to the general public. You're saying everybody has a certain set of rights now in my original work. And you saw the list of the different varieties of Creative Commons licenses that are available. And because there's a bunch of different licenses, it allows you to customize the subset of your exclusive rights that you are granting to the public. The most restrictive of these is the CC BY NC ND license, which says you can copy and redistribute as much as you want, but you can't make commercial reuse of my work without checking with me first. You can't create derivative versions of my work without checking with me first. The least restrictive is CC BY, which says you can do anything you want with my work as long as you clearly acknowledge that I am the author of the original version of that work. There is an additional CC instrument that is the CC0, which is actually not a license, it's a waiver. With CC0, you can officially place your work into the public domain. Say, I claim no copyright prerogatives at all in this article. The important thing to understand, one important thing to understand about CC BY is that once you adopt CC BY, what you have basically done is you have given up your right to say no. You have preemptively said yes to everyone. That means anybody can take your article and publish it in, so this is something that has happened where a young woman who is a biologist was surprised to find that an article she had written was being sold in a very expensive book, a collection of articles on biology. And she contacted the publisher and said, I didn't give you permission to put my article in your $150 book. And he said, well, sure you did. You published it under a CC BY license, and this is exactly the kind of reuse that is contemplated by that kind of license, which is true. Which is great if you want to do that. What it means is that you need to understand what you're getting into before you undertake that course of action. Now, how do copyright and licensing and the open access movement intersect? David made reference to the strictest definition of open access, which involves CC BY. I would put it a little bit differently. There are competing definitions of open access out there. Those who are most evangelical about open access tend to feel that it's not real open access unless it involves CC BY licensing. It's not just that everybody gets free access to the content, it's that everybody gets free access and carte blanche to reuse that content in any way they want. That is real open access. But there are also significant segments of the open access community that don't believe that CC BY is sine qua non for OA. If you look at the directory of open access journals, many of the journals that are included in that directory, which is widely regarded as a signal of being a real open access journal, they allow publication under CC BY-NC or even CC BY-NC-ND. So the question of what defines true OA is still somewhat unsettled in that community. However, the most commonly generally accepted definition is the one in the Berlin Declaration on Open Access to Knowledge in the Sciences and the Humanities, and there's a link to that declaration on this slide. It's also really important to understand that whenever you accept grant funding or whenever you enter into an employment agreement with an institution, whenever you matriculate in a graduate program, or whenever you submit an article for publication, a condition of doing any of those things may be the acceptance of a provision that your work will be made available on an open access basis under some definition of OA. You have got to find out what that is before you agree to make your work available that way. I'm particularly concerned in this regard for graduate students who may be thrilled to learn that they've been accepted to a PhD program in a particular field, only to find out as they're finishing up their dissertations that as a condition of their graduation, they're going to have to make their dissertation publicly available in some way that they would not prefer to make it available. That's something that's a cavea ad emptor thing, right? It is their responsibility to know that at the time that they matriculate. For those of us who are further along in our professions, I feel like it's our responsibility to help make sure that they think about that stuff early on. CCBY is in many ways a wonderful tool, I think. The pros are pretty obvious. The more broadly you make your work reusable, the more likely it is that people are going to encounter it and read it and possibly build upon your ideas. If you want your work to be freely reusable and you don't want, and you know, let's say that your theory that the works of Shakespeare were written by Harpo Marx, let's say that goes viral and it becomes this worldwide sensation and everybody wants to reprint or redistribute the article in which you laid out this idea. You don't want to be getting 30 emails a day from people saying, is it okay if I redistribute this article? You might want everybody to be able to do it without having to ask you and leave you alone. CCBY gives you a very handy tool for doing that. And of course it does leave in place your right of attribution. Now it's important to recognize that in the United States, the right of attribution is more of a professional norm than it is a legal right. Moral rights under copyright law are not particularly well established in US jurisprudence. They are much, much more solidly established in the UK and the Commonwealth. Nevertheless, CCBY specifically requires people to acknowledge you as the originator. One problem with CCBY is, again, since you have lost the right to say no, you've lost the right to say in what venue your work will appear and with whom it will be affiliated. You've lost the right to say whether or not other people can use your work to make money. You may care about that and you may not, but some people certainly do. Derivative works can be a particularly sticky issue, I think, for humanists. So let's say you're a poet and somebody decides to translate your poem into Swahili. If you've made your poem available under a CCBY license, you have no say in how or whether that Swahili translation of your poem gets published. You may disagree that it's a good translation, and yet not only can it be published without your consent, it has to be published with your name on it, which could be a real problem if it's a crap translation. So this is the type of issue that tends to come up in the humanities that may not be so much of an issue in the hard sciences. And then, of course, if there is any potential commercial market for your work, then making it available on a CCBY basis tends to undermine that. So 4 things that I hope you take away from this presentation, if nothing else. The first one is that it is really important to understand these issues. This may seem like inside baseball for publishing. It is not. There are people working to change policy both at the national level and at the institutional level that will have real concrete effects on the rights that you have in your original work. You owe it to yourselves to know what's going on, to know what the issues are, and to make your voice heard if you so desire. Again, never sign a publishing agreement or an employment agreement without reading it carefully. This is obvious, right? And yet how often do we do it, especially in a very tight job market, without reading it, particularly looking for the implications that your employment or your matriculation or your publishing might have for your rights as a copyright holder. Talked about grad students already. The other thing is never be afraid to negotiate. Negotiating with publishers, it's not the same thing as negotiating for a salary, right? If you get offered a job and they say, we'd like to offer you $50,000, and you come back and say, well, I really want $120,000, you're running a real risk that they're going to say, oh, okay, never mind, and walk away. The same thing isn't true when you're negotiating license terms or author rights. The likelihood that they're going to walk away and say, well, never mind, then if you want to negotiate, you can't publish in our journal, that's relatively low. All right, so there's my contact info. Happy to talk about this stuff at tiresome length with anybody who wants to geek out about it. And thank you very much.
So So I'm breaking a cardinal rule here of slides, which is having a ton of text on the first. Let me just tell you what that text is from, and I'm happy to share it with anyone, but you can just go on your phones right now and find it, which is a report called The Rising Metric Tide, a report from the Higher Education Funding Councils of England last year, 2015, which was a really close, careful analysis of the implications of metrics and how metrics are being used to evaluate scholars and scholarship. I throw up all this text here right on the first slide, in part to suggest that this topic of metrics is one that people are taking very seriously. Many of the scholarly publishing movements that David and that Rick have talked about are ones that are being kind of, I think, coming to a head for scholars in the way their work and their success or relative success is evaluated in metrical terms. And like so much else in our lives, I think it's really important that we understand precisely how this is being constructed and what it means. Rick said, I'm sure everyone here knows what copyright is, and after 25 years as a professional historian, I would say, yeah, I know what copyright is. But actually, every time I hear Rick talk about this, and he's recently written something for Perspectives that's really worth taking a look at, I learn something new, or I think about it in a slightly different way. When I went to graduate school, and I'm sorry to say often when I'm talking with my own graduate students, these issues about their work and the ecosystem into which their work is flowing are not ones that I have emphasized, and I don't think they're ones we've traditionally emphasized. When we think about our scholarship, we think about who's going to publish me, how can I get into that journal, who will take my book. We think about it on the other side, how can I read as much as I want, how can I get access to the articles that I want, how can I get access to the books that I want. Oh my God, those horrible e-books with the, you can only see 40 pages at a time. Sorry, EBSCO, I'm talking about you. Those are the things we think about, but all of that actually is now a product of the very things that David and that Rick are talking about. I'm going to talk about something slightly different again, which is metrics. And I think it's really important to understand what the basic metrics are that are being tossed around for describing scholarly publishing. They're not ones that I think most historians are familiar with, but they're very important for us to understand. Like a lot of this, these are things that were created in the real behemoth of scholarly publishing, which is the STEM fields and particularly biomedical, but which are being applied to the humanities and to historians, which have a very distinct disciplinary publishing culture within the humanities relatively indiscriminately. So let's just start with some basics, and I'm not going to apologize for being really basic about this. So the first thing I want to just talk about very quickly are traditional metrics and the way that publishing metrics come both in terms of evaluating the journals and in terms of the author. I'm going to get to in a moment one glaring thing you'll notice right away as historians. We're book field people. We're not article. This is not an article field. It's still a book field. But these metrics are designed for fields in which journals and articles are the predominant kind of apex form of publishing your research. So for journals, the most important piece is citation analysis. You heard reference to this from David and from Rick about how often one's work gets cited and what does it mean that that work gets cited. So basically we're talking about something called the journal impact factor. That's usually the shorthand here. The journal impact factor is a product that is generated and sold by Thomson Reuters, and they create this journal impact factor out of these journal citation reports, which they develop every year. I'm going to come back to this point about business models for associated industries around scholarly publishing that is outside of what we're writing and what we're reading. The other things that often get accounted as metrical evaluations of journals are selectivity. How selective is a journal? And these analyses are generated somewhat more informally. Not all journals are willing to give up information about how selective they are, but you can find information in various kinds of library reports. If you simply Google, journal selectivity. There are various publications which assess this, but it's really the journal impact factor which is the most significant. In terms of authors, how authors are evaluated in the citation analysis, again, this comes from companies, all of whom, except for Google Scholar, have their work packaged and sold, essentially, in which you can access through your library or some other way, the Web of Science, or Scopus, which is citation, which is a product from Elsevier, and produces counts within a database of journals. I went and looked to see how many historical journals are in Scopus. I won't tell you, it's kind of depressing. And then again, the H-index, which measures an author's research outputs. The H-index looks at how much an author has published over time and then kind of does a stir on citations, and citations bubbling up from particularly journal citations from journal articles to other journal articles. There's been a lot of discussion, and it's worth just dipping into online about the high quality of the H-index for measuring humanists in particular, but even in the hard sciences, Einstein famously couldn't get tenure based on his very low H-index value. So what's really important, I think, for historians to think about is citation analytics and disciplinary differences. Just in the last year, I had 3 tenure cases that I was asked to look at, 2 of them in an emergency basis, because deans who were not familiar with humanities, and particularly with publishing in history, were looking askance at historians who had published without a significant journal impact factor journal represented on their CV, and who didn't have a high enough H-index. So I just thought I would share with you some very bald information here about how these analytics work across disciplines. Essentially, the H-index, if you looked at the H-index on the left there, which comes from Google Scholar, and this is for all English language, you have to go down to number 75 to find any journal roughly in the humanities, and that's an economics journal. There is nothing even loosely in the humanities in the top 100 journals in the English language. And even when you go to humanities journals, what you would see is that even in humanities journals, the American Historical Review doesn't show up until like number 25 or something like that. And their impact factors are, let us just say, microscopic. So when you look on the right here, you'll see the American Historical Review, and you'll see also below it, you'll see the William & Mary Quarterly, the journal that my institute publishes. So even for a kind of premier historical journal in our discipline, the American Historical Review has an impact factor of like 19, whereas Nature is up there in the high 100s. So we're talking about metrics that are not made for us, let us just say. And this is problematic when we're talking to our colleagues across the university or outside of the university who simply don't understand how these metrics have been designed, basically not for us, but also how they can really harm the evaluation of historical scholarship or humanistic scholarship. And the other thing I would just mention here is just go back to a point I briefly alluded to, is that history is a book discipline. It's not an article discipline. So most of this metrical analysis relies on being able to scoop citation information out of online available, electronically available research. And that mostly means journals, because so much of the journal publication, even in the humanities and history now, of course, is fully available online. Even if not freely available, it is available through JSTOR or some other aggregator. But books are not. So it can, for example, the Google Scholar can scoop books that Google has fully scanned, but it can't do other things. So book disciplines are going to be punished in this respect. The other thing I would point to is that we simply don't cite one another the way that scientists do. Humanists our citation practices are really different. They're quantitatively different and they're qualitatively different. There was a rather irksome piece on the LSE Impact blog, a blog that irks me, I have to say, a lot, but last year, saying essentially, humanists, we need to cite each other more, and the purpose for citing one another more was so we could plump these H-index. Right, it's madness, absolute madness. And then one would ask, okay, if we're not citing one another a lot, why is that? Is it because we don't read and appreciate one another's work? No, that's not the case. It's that our citation habits are simply different. The way that we choose to cite one another we cite examples, for example, of a body of scholarship. We will call out one particular piece. But even so, I looked at one particular publication in the William & Mary Quarterly last year. This is one thing that's been fun to do, is to take the quarterly and put it under the scope for these purposes of conversations about scholarly publishing. And I looked at 104 footnotes to see how many of those were not critical, right? Because if you're counting all citations, that presumes you're counting everything, even if it's a critical citation saying this is balderdash, right? So citations, thumbs down citations count as much as thumbs up. But so I looked at 104, how many of those were either not critical or were actually engaging with the subject of the research. We're not simply saying, this is a classic for historians, right? For more on the South Sea bubble, C, right? And then you list 4 or 5 things. And there were 58 of those 104 citations to secondary sources that were actually, represented a meaningful engagement. That is, the argument in the article was actually informed by either the information in or the argument in that other piece. So that tells you something too. We do cite differently. And then the last thing I'd want to mention about disciplinary differences and citation conventions, and you can see that all I'm doing here, right, is giving this a close reading. I'm being a good historian, I hope, is that journals have very different conventions. Just thinking about my own field of early American history, the Journal of the Early Republic will not look at a manuscript that is more than 9,000 words inclusive of notes. Whereas the JAH, for example, will consider between 10 and 14,000 words, but that has to include everything. So you can have, whatever kind of ratio you want. The William & Mary Quarterly, on the other hand, for reasons I really don't know, I've tried to find out why this is the case, you have a ceiling of 10,000 words of text and 5,000 words of notes, which tells you something about the quarterly too, right? That's quite a ratio there. But that means that the article that I looked at with 104 footnotes, that author likely was a little more discursive in their notes for the quarterly than she would have been for the JAH or for the JER if the research had been applicable to those two publications. So simply counting citations really, I think, is hugely problematic for us. It's problematic for historians for reasons that I've suggested about the differences between our discipline and something like biomedical, but it's problematic also because citations themselves are not transparently obvious unit of measurement. Altmetrics. Altmetrics describe themselves, I don't have to describe them this way, as attention data. That is, altmetrics is a move to try to get away from traditional citation analyses and rather look at, are there other ways in which scholarship is making an impact. Impact is a big word in our world. And that impact gets measured in part through presence in social media, through mentions on blogs, and in the news, like the mainstream news media. And you can go to altmetric.com, which is a company. Yes, it is. This isn't just a groovy scholar-led movement. It is a company that sells its product. And you can see that there are different ways that they evaluate mentions, and actually those rainbow colors have meaning. Blue is social media, and I think traditional media is red, and so on, and they assign a number there. I've pulled a really excellent January 2016 piece on plantation economy, and particularly looking at livestock. And this piece gets a 1 for the altmetric factor. Well, okay, that tells us something, which is in part that historians digest things slowly. If we look at what are the most referenced articles for history journals, they tend to go back quite a long way. When we looked at the JSTOR data for the quarterly for 2014, the median citation or download was 1992. Historians digest slowly, and we use work for a long time. We've found that the high number, the peak for download articles, which we take sometimes as a proxy for classroom use, but not always, is really like 5 to 8 years after publication. So 1 year, which is the kind of premium for science publications, are almost meaningless for us. I also did just out of curiosity look to see how many times this article has been downloaded, and it's actually doing fairly well comparatively. It's been downloaded about 1,200 times and viewed about another 1,000 times. Right, I've mentioned this issue about what and how we're counting, but there's something else that I think is really important in terms of what we're counting and what it means. Because we're counting citations from journal articles to journal articles, we're leaving out books. Because we're looking at a relatively short window, we lose the long gestation period for historians. Because we're looking at clicks, downloads, and social media engagement, we often can be looking at a kind of glancing attention rather than deep and sustained attention. Josh Piker, the editor of the Quarterly, has a piece coming out on our blog in a week or so that looks at a really fantastic website, Vince Brown's website on slave revolts in Jamaica, 1761-62, which was the subject of an AHR roundtable on digital history, a really fantastic website. And Vince has some really eye-popping numbers about in the first week I guess there was a Reddit conversation about the site, and there were 33,000 views in one day, which was, kind of a lot. Josh calls it a kind of World of Wrestling SmackDown kind of experience for a history website. But then we looked at, okay, so what does that mean about journal articles? Can journal articles never promise, even in my field, never promise that kind of attention? And we took, okay, so let's go look at some articles and let's look at how many times they've been reprinted, how much classroom use, how many times have they been viewed on JSTOR and on Project Muse, how many times circulated through our free and online, our new app, and all these other ways. And we came up with actually a lot more than 33,000, and we think maybe more sustained engagement. I don't know. But in any case, we're counting here social media engagement, which can be a kind of glancing blow. 2 minutes on a website is considered a lot. Another really critical piece of this, however, is suggested in my snarky subtitle to this wonderful cartoon, which David gave me, actually, which is about the implicit bias in all of these metrics. Many of us are familiar with, and it's extraordinarily well documented, the gender bias in teaching evaluations and the other kinds of biases in teaching evaluations, and yet most of our institutions continue to use student teaching of student evaluations of teaching as a way of assessing teaching. Even my own wonderful institution still uses teaching evaluations to talk about who's a good teacher and who's not, even though we know how biased these can be. And these citation analyses are the same. You might think unproblematically that, a click or a download is a click or a download, and how do they reflect bias? But it's fairly well documented, and in some cases extremely well documented. First of all, there's the primacy effect, that if your article is listed first in the William & Mary Quarterly, even the William & Mary Quarterly, without the circulation of, some fantastic Wiley Blackwell journal, you'll get more downloads. You'll get more attention, actually, if it's published first. And I can tell you that this causes an enormous headache. It's almost like let's just throw it all up in the air to decide what comes first, rather than take on the responsibility of knowing that you have handed someone more attention, really. And what does that mean? Does that mean that Article 1 is that much better, more important, more significant, more relevant for the field than Article 4? Of course not. It means that it came first, and by the way that we read things now, it is getting more of the kind of attention that's getting evaluated in these analyses. The other thing that's obviously important is the gender bias, and I'd like to see more analyses of bias that extends to other kinds of issues, but extraordinarily well documented that men tend to cite men, and that women are just much less cited. So all of these metrical evaluations, I think, are vulnerable to accusations of bias, as well as being kind of facile, actually, at least for historians. And if there's one lesson, Rick got to offer you 4, but if I get to offer 1, it's simply that we need to be good historians of this kind of data. We need to look at it closely. We need to ask how it's being collected, how it's being used. Libraries often have excellent resources explaining the nature of these kinds of metrics. And for many of us, at least of my generation, some of this is a little bit news, but it shouldn't be. And it certainly should be information that our students feel is widely available to them. So, thank you. So we will We will very happily take questions, and some of them we might deflect back to some really talented and knowledgeable people in the audience here. So,
I just had a question for Crotty. Why are Oxford and Cambridge? I realized they were large. I didn't realize they were so. And they are different. I mean, isn't Oxford different from Cambridge in many respects?
Yeah, but I mean, we're similar sized. I think OUP has more journals. I mean, we've both been around for like 500 years. I think there's a certain level of just historical accretion. And I think they're different in a lot of ways because both universities at some point made an effort to say, we're going to run this as a business and bring in publishing business sort of expertise. You know, at OUP, we're still under the guidance of the delegates of Oxford University Press, who are the professors of Oxford and knowledgeable professors from around the world. So any book we publish, any journal we take on, we have to go and get approval when we do any sort of our major business activities. We have to get approval from the academic side of things, but a lot of it is driven, I think, in a much more, I guess, business-oriented fashion than a lot of the right. I just think the management, I think a lot of university presses are sort of run on campus. They're much more run by the academic sphere than necessarily they are people who are coming and approaching this with a background in business and business expertise. So we're sort of in this middle ground of it's all business, it's all mission, and I think OUP and CUP fall somewhere in the middle of business-driven mission, I guess. And I think that's led to a lot of success and a lot of growth. But it's also, historical but I always tell people when this guy Gutenberg showed up in Oxford 500 years ago, the Don said, that's a good idea, we should get one of those things. And we've been publishing since then, so.
David, as an outsider, and I guess with Rick as well, why do you think humanities were so slow, I guess, to get into the open access conversation?
There's no money there, I think, is some of it. It's less obvious how to make it work unless you have a significant amount of funding. I think, I'm basing this semi-anecdotally and on a couple of studies. I think humanities gets treated really poorly at universities. I'm a former scientist, and as a former scientist, I know the world revolves around scientists because, look, I brought in $1 million grant, I brought in $5 million of grants, but at the same, and you humanities people are just riding on my coattails, I'm paying for you. The reality is there have been a lot of studies that show pretty much every science research program is a money loser for their university. When you start looking at the numbers, and I think UCLA and Duke have both done studies on this, you have I'm a researcher. I brought in $5 million in grants. I'm running a big lab with expensive equipment and a huge amount of overhead. Here's a historian who needs, a desk in a library, basically. And now let's look at the undergraduates. We have 10,000 students at the school. 70 to 80% of them are humanities majors. They're paying tuition. So who's really paying the bills at the school? I think that in a lot of ways gets obscured by these big numbers from grants. And I'd love to see more studies along these lines. And I'd love to see the humanities get the actual credit of no, we're carrying you guys to spread these grants that I think it deserves. So I think some of it is that people see these big money grants. Oh, look, the NIH is giving us this money, so let's do what they say to do.
I think another contributing factor that has to do with grants is that humanists writing articles are typically they're not reporting on grant-funded research that they can draw upon to pay article processing charges. So you've basically got two general ways to make your work available on an OA basis. You can either publish in an author pays venue, in which case you'd better have $1,500 to $2,500 in order to pay for that privilege, which somebody operating on a $500,000 grant has got, or you're going to deposit the final approved manuscript of your article into your local institutional repository. I don't think that humanists are any less excited about doing that than scientists are, but the reality is nobody cares about doing that. I don't know a single library running an institutional repository that has had a really significant amount of success in getting faculty interested in depositing their work. Faculty deposit their work when they're given no other choice, and the people who can give them no other choice are funders. And so there you go. There's no real handle on the humanists from the funders, speaking in large numbers.
Along those same lines, I wonder how publishers and journalists feel about the uses of academia.edu. It seems to me that I can go on there and I find an essay from an important essay collection in its entirety, sometimes with articles that weren't even penned by a specific author, it might be the whole collection. At other times, it's just a link to a specific journal. Where do you stand on the uses of these?
Right, so I was discussing, I'm doing a talk in a couple of weeks on sort of piracy and reuse and everything in between. So there's the sort of legitimate end of things where, we try, certainly OUP and a lot of other journal publishers try and be as liberal as possible of, you can take this version of this, you can post it on your website after a certain embargo period or do these things. And these university repositories and subject-specific repositories that Rick mentioned are sort of the very legitimate ways we're trying to responsibly do that. Then you have the dark side of things, the sort of Sci-Hub, the flat-out law-breaking piracy. And then in the middle fall these SCNs, these scholarly collaboration networks. So academia.edu, despite the .edu name, is venture capital backed. It is a for-profit company, as is ResearchGate. Academia bought the domain from someone else who bought it before the rule went in that you have to actually be an educational institution to have that URL. And basically they're kind of this gray area. There's a massive amount of material on those sites that is illegally there, that is illicitly. It's a violation of copyright. I think, Elsevier says 25% of this most recent year's material is publicly available. That includes an awful lot of books as well. We are trying to work with these companies. To say, all right, there are reasonable services that you guys provide, and we think you're really interesting, but let's try and work together and collaborate, and you either need to figure out how to license this stuff or how to adhere to the law. We send lots of takedown notices, and then we get really bad press for doing that, so we don't do that very often. But I compare it to the early days of YouTube, basically, where YouTube happened, and it was just completely filled with stuff people had recorded off their television that was illegally up there. And so then all the film and TV companies started suing YouTube, and then they were just having really expensive lawsuits for years and years and years, and eventually they said, hey, you know what? This works better if we work together, so I'm going to give you a license to use my content, you're going to sell ads against it, and then we're going to share the money, and now everybody wins. And so the idea is, can we work with ResearchGate and academia.edu in particular and say, let's find a way for us to mutually benefit without having to go through years of expensive litigation. And there are a lot of publishing industry groups that are involved in conversations with them right now. But as a rule, OUP's policy is, you have the author's original version, the version that you wrote and first submitted to the paper. You can do anything you want with that at any point. Put it on your website, put it on academia.edu, whatever. The accepted manuscript, so this is the point where we said, yes, we've reviewed it, yes, you are accepted to the journal. That you can put on any non-commercial site after the journal's embargo period ends, which is 12 months, or I think in the humanities, 24 months for some of those journals, but non-commercial. We consider ResearchGate and academia.edu commercial site. And then there's the final published version, which if you want to put it up somewhere, you need to get a license to do that. But I think people don't realize how commercial those sites are, and basically their business model was going to be selling ads, and they realized there just aren't enough researchers in the world to get the scale of a Google or a Facebook. So now they're saying basically we're going to spy on researchers, we're going to see what they say to one another, we're going to see what they read, and we're going to collect that data and we're going to sell it to pharma companies or whoever wants it. I'm not sure that's an actual business model. I'm not sure anybody really wants that data or is willing to pay for it, but it sort of gets to the surveillance business model of a lot of the online stuff now. And I think I'm not sure how comfortable a lot of people are with it.
I know we've sent takedown notices quite, not regularly, but we send a bunch every year, and every time we've used it as an opportunity to have a conversation with our authors and to explain why it is we're asking them to take it down. And we used it to do a close analysis of the hundreds of hours that it takes to review a manuscript and to develop the argument in a manuscript, and to do pay highly skilled manuscript editors, most of whom have graduate degrees in history, and to pay our source verification program and all the rest of it. It's hundreds of hours of work, and there isn't anyone who has said after we gave them all that information, oh no, you're right, I should be able to post my PDF, on academia.edu. So,
One thing that I've been noticing so when I started my career in libraries 25 years ago, it was very common to hear people say, oh, librarians are the great defenders of copyright. As the open access movement has grown, and as librarians have become more and more enthralled with the idea of open access, I feel like, especially in recent years, the word copyright has become more and more of a dirty word. It's very hard, if you bring up copyright in a room full of librarians, you see a lot of head shaking and a lot of sneering. And I think that that's really interesting and kind of troubling. I mean, I get where it's coming from, but it just sets little alarm bells kind of going off in my head. I feel like we need to bring this to the surface. We as a profession, meaning librarians, we need to decide where we stand on the issue of copyright. There's any number of positions that we might take and say, copyright in principle is a good thing, but we wish the copyright law were different in X, Y, and Z ways. Or what I think is the sort of sub rosa attitude, which is copyright just gets in the way of everybody having free access to everything, which I think is a kind of an overly simplistic attitude, and one that if that were to become a very common and openly expressed view in libraries, would set us pretty much at odds with an awful lot of the scholars that we serve. Those are only, 2 points on a very large spectrum of possible attitudes towards copyright, but I really do feel like there's a major shift going on in my profession in terms of whether we think that copyright is, on balance, a good thing or a bad thing.
I'll follow, I start with my introduction, I think we're at this point of this sort of first internet wave has broken, and now we're at this point of reckoning of, okay, this has massively changed society, this has massively changed the way we communicate. What's good about it? What's problematic about it? How do we want to go forward from here? And I think rather than just automatically assuming that, everyone in Silicon Valley is an awesome super genius and has our best interests in mind, we need to start critically thinking about what's going on, thinking about how to regulate a lot of these groups and to preserve what we want to preserve. And I think that the copyright conversation is a huge part of it, because technology has vastly outpaced copyright laws, and so
Which it always does.
yeah.
Every technological innovation in communication immediately overpowers copyright, and then you have to sort of
Scrape it back.
drag things back to a point of more or less equilibrium, and then there's another huge innovation.
Yeah.
But I think David's point is an excellent one, that, we're so far beyond just simple information literacy here. We are really in the need, I think all of us would probably agree, for a much more subtle and sophisticated understanding about the production of information and the circulation of information and its consumption, and the infrastructures around it, and the motivations behind the dissemination and so on. Yeah.
Are you seeing any interesting models of alternative forms of publication, maybe influenced by the digital humanities, like non-text-based scholarship, or not exclusively text-based scholarship, or even some of the alternative forms of peer review? Is that having an impact?
So, I guess what I would say is that it's a little bit like open access, that many of the impulses behind alternatives to traditional peer review I absolutely embrace. That is, I'm not sure there is a kind of higher value proposition here than thinking about diversifying scholarship, both who produces it and what kind we're producing and how it gets out there. But it is not always the case that obviously open access or alternative open peer review or post-publication peer review are answers to those things. In fact, sometimes they end up being barriers in the ways that we are precisely concerned about. So for example, with peer review, we've looked closely at how well peer review manages that is double-blind peer review. How well does it serve junior scholars who are in a more vulnerable or underrepresented situation, either in terms of their own personal identity or the scholarship that they're producing. And it turns out that anonymous peer review, double-blind peer review, does a better job than open peer review. At least that's what we found, and that's what I think the brief cases we've looked at. But again, I think this is very disciplinary specific. In literature, there is a more of a push to do open peer review and kind of in-process peer review and so on. I haven't seen any particularly successful models of that yet, although a lot of discussion about it. I think Planned Obsolescence was a book that a lot of people hold up as an example of in-process peer review, but every time I go and look at what were the comments that were being made that made a substantive difference, they're so far from the kind of peer review that I see even on journal articles that I'm like, I'm not sure what the gain is there, and particularly not a gain for what I say is these really, really high-level values of diversifying and making more accessible scholarship. In terms of digital humanities, one thing that I think is quite important is thinking about how we take digital humanities from a kind of vertical presentation to a horizontal presentation, and the question of how mobile access is going to affect that. We've been experimenting with an app that embeds digital work with long-form scholarship, but we'll see. There's a report upcoming on this issue. For now, there are very few journals, though, that are. I mean, as you probably know from the basis of your question, very few journals that are able to do kind of long-form scholarship with integrated digital content and commit to peer review and have the funding base to do all of that. So it's hugely important, maybe over the horizon. Yeah.
I just had a question maybe for Rick about ProQuest and what you can do with your work once you've enforced it, uploaded it.
Are you talking about dissertations specifically? Oh, yeah.
Mine has been under embargo for 2 years, and it's about to come up, and I am having a Dickens at a time, even with a literary agent, trying to get any of it published, and in a book form, I haven't really attempted.
So if I understand the question, your dissertation has been uploaded to digital dissertations, but it's currently under embargo?
It's just about to come off.
Okay, so it's been there for a couple of years. People haven't been able to get access to it. Shortly they will be able to, but in the meantime, you're having a hard time getting a book deal. Are you sure that it's specifically because it's been uploaded to digital dissertations?
That's what I've been told by my agent. So I've been encouraged to change the name of it, obviously.
Yeah.
To change, as she put it, to dissect a lot of stuff out of it so it doesn't resemble the dissertation.
So that's sound advice. For those who couldn't hear, she's getting advice from her literary agent to significantly revise the dissertation before submitting it for publication. That's good advice no matter what. No reputable publisher is going to publish an unrevised dissertation. Generally speaking, you're going to have to revise it substantially anyway, and changing the title is always a good idea. Now, on the more comforting side of this advice, I think that for most university presses anyway, it's a given that an awful lot of what they're going to publish are going to be revised dissertations. So I don't think the fact that it was a dissertation, the fact that it was put in the digital dissertations database should itself be a significant impediment to getting a revised version published. How much revision you've got to do is going to vary to some degree. But if your agent is telling you the only reason you're having trouble is because your dissertation was uploaded to ProQuest, you might want to think about getting a different agent. I think she's blowing smoke.
Yeah, I mean, there have been a lot of articles about this very question. They go around to different presses and say, will you consider something if it's publicly available? And it's always a mixed bag of answers, with probably the majority are usually, yeah, I'll still take a look at it if it's really good. I'm going to want to publish it. Some publishers say, no, we won't look at anything that's out in an open access manner or something like that. So it's not a black and white sort of question, I guess.
At least in my experience, there are two kind of crucial things, and I think Rick alluded to this in his conversation about licenses. One is that we ought to be just much clearer with graduate students about the implications of an automatic policy that their work will be open through ProQuest, which is, again, it's a company, right? I mean, they have to pay people, and they need to make money, and so on. But I belatedly, we found out that our library had signed an agreement that all dissertations would be automatically open immediately through ProQuest, and now we have a policy where students get to choose. I too agree that publishers, especially in history, maybe not so much in some other social science disciplines, but particularly in history and literature, all university press publishers and other publishers are going to want to work with an author to significantly revise, deepen, and extend their analysis, and sometimes even their research. But even so, even though it's the case that nobody's been able to come up with a survey where presses say, no, I'll never look at, a dissertation that's openly available on ProQuest, or it doesn't matter, one way or the other. We can't get a survey that says either one of those things, basically. Even though that's the case, I think students need to have the choice. They really need to have a choice, and they need to have a full choice, not just a choice that says you can choose somewhere between 1 and 2 years, or 1 and no years, or something. They need to have a really full choice.
And again, this is an area in which there are, and this sounds, I don't know, this may sound a way I don't mean it to sound, but there are people and organizations out there working hard to ensure that students do not have that choice. And that's something that you guys as historians need to be aware of. There are people who want to make it policy, whether federal or institutional, and they work at every level, to say, no, everything must be open. Everything must be open from day one, and it must be completely open under these terms. And if you agree with that, great. Join the voices that are saying that. If you disagree with it, your voice also needs to be heard. There needs to be a conversation about it. And there won't be if only part of the affected constituency is involved in it knows what's going on.
So sort of in light of that, I have some panel feel about AHA's statement about grad students embargoing their dissertations, I think it was for 5 years.
6.
Yeah.
AHA proposed, so what's been traditionally the case is that dissertations, you can typically embargo them for up to 3 years. AHA, for those of you who don't know, put out a statement that said, we encourage departments of history specifically to allow embargoes of up to 6 years on the electronic version of the dissertation, as long as a print copy of the dissertation is made publicly available during that entire period. When they put that statement out, the open access community absolutely lost its mind. And I mean, the name calling, it was horrible. The kind of vicious abuse that the AHA came under from people who disagreed. Personally, my view is I feel like the author of an original work ought to be able to do whatever the hell they want with their original work. If she wants to embargo her dissertation permanently, well, okay. The electronic version anyway, I really support the long-standing tradition of at least making a print copy of the dissertation a part of the library collection at the degree-granting institution, right? So you get a PhD at the University of Utah, your dissertation, it seems to me, ought to be a part of that library collection and be available. Whether it needs to be made freely available to everybody in the world to do with whatever they want, I think that, to me, that should be up to the author. That's just me.
So I guess part of it has to do with, yes, so it sounds like everybody, agrees on like sort of free choice.
No, everybody doesn't.
Yeah, everybody does.
The idea of free choice is hugely controversial.
Yeah. And there's
How do you feel, I guess, about the association encouraging? Is my question.
Well, what I would say is, first of all, it's worth just reading a little bit online about the controversy that ensued. about that policy change, and there have been roundtables at past AHAs about this. I can say for myself that I think the AHA was actually taking a pretty measured step, although it was seen by some as really radical to suggest this long kind of embargo period of 6 years. From my perspective, for my own students, I want them to be able to choose 20 years if they want to choose 20 years, because I actually do not know. I do not know what the implications are. And actually, I have students who are working in fields that are right at the very edge of, really hot stuff. And I have students whose work is going to take 5 more years to incubate, and there are all kinds of reasons, and I don't know all of them, and I don't know how the landscape is going to change in 5 years. In other words, I want them to take ownership of that, and part of taking ownership of that is understanding at least something about this changing infrastructure of publishing. So I understand the 6-year suggestion. I would have just said, students have the right to choose and need to be kind of involved in conversations about this. At my own university at William & Mary, we now have, after long and intense discussions about this, the policy now is that students can actually petition for whatever period of time they want. But they do have to sit down with a librarian, and they do have to sit down with their advisor, and they have to articulate a little bit about why they've made the choice that they have. In other words, it is a kind of, it does have to be a measured choice. It does have to be a choice that it takes place after a process.
One thing that very quickly got lost in the backlash to the AHA statement was what the AHA statement actually said. Because those who reacted to it almost invariably misrepresented what it said. The AHA did not call for 6-year embargoes. The AHA did not even encourage 6-year embargoes. What it called for is for departments to allow an embargo of up to 6 years if the student wants it. That's all it said. Mm-hmm. And they were responded to as if they were saying, lock down all the dissertations for 6 years, and some of the responses actually directly misquoted the statement and then flew off in a rage based on that misquote. So that was a big part of the rhetoric around the statement, was just, in some cases, radical misrepresentation of what it said.
Right, and a lot of the rhetoric, again, came from the sciences of, well, the NIH paid for this research. How can you lock it up for 6 years? Well, the NIH didn't pay for a historian's research. That belongs to that historian.
They really should.
If only it had.
And I think it really speaks to the problem that we're seeing a lot of these one-size-fits-all sort of policies. I mean, the impact factor, Karin talked about. I think, AHR talks about, well, citation peak for most articles starts around 5 years. Yep. Well, the impact factor looks at what happened in years 2 and 3. Yep. Is that a fair metric for that? Well, biomedical stuff moves much faster. That's when the citation peak is. Let's use that. The embargo period for the U.S. federal government is 12 months. Why? Well, that's what works for biomedical stuff, even though if you look at the usage half-life of articles, biomedical is the fastest way over here. Everything else, math, arts,
classics,
humanities,
philosophy,
everything is way over here. So you're choosing this one crazy outlier, and they're setting the pace for everything. And I think it just, it's a real problem in subtle details and saying, you know what, this type of field is different from this field. One policy that works here doesn't necessarily work here. It's really hard to get, both a coherent argument out and to get a policy that will recognize those subtleties.
And actually, even the White House statement says 12 months is a guideline, but every agency should adjust it as makes sense for their particular field.
Yeah.
I think we're about to run over time. Yes. I would just say one last thing, which is that the reason that the Hefke policy is up there on my slide is that in the United States, it's very difficult to get one policy on a lot of these things, but that in England, it's happened very quickly because there is centralized control over higher education and over requirements for higher education publishing. So many of us in publishing have had to deal with the mandates of the British government, and that's been an interesting and exciting ride in and of itself. So I guess, like good historians, we're calling for complexity here, right? So anyway, thank you all.